Recording in progress. Awesome. All right. So my first question for our panelists is, what have been the most significant successes and setbacks in the adoption of open science practices? And I am going to kick things off with Zoltan, if you're willing to start us off.
Yeah, thanks. When I think about that, I think not to pinpoint anything in particular. I think one of the major successes is a change in culture, that we now have a set of values. I mean, there persists. There's two sets of values really. There's the careerist set of values, that what you do is you publish in the highest impact factor journal. You do what you can to get your paper into the top-notch journals and get a grant coming in, that sort of thing. That's a set of values that persists. But there's definitely a new set of values now, and that sort of permeates the culture. It's part of the culture to varying degrees in different places, but you can always refer to those open science values, and people will know them, and probably will, unless I live in a bubble, are unlikely to argue against them, unless they're being highly cynical, and they might think they're being pragmatic or whatever. To me, that's the biggest thing. We've changed now the whole discourse. Just people respect all sorts of things. I mean, there's open data, open materials, registered reports, pre-registration, reproducibility, and so on. But you know, that's part of how we judge people's work. In maybe this relates to another question, but I also think that the extent to which that culture is really there varies by country and for different disciplines. And this is just anecdotal, and I can't really swear to this, but I think maybe in the UK, in the Netherlands, it's more pervasive, a culture of open science within universities, and it's an interesting question why that is. But in the UK, I mean, one of the things we have is the UK Reproducibility Network, UKRN, and that has representatives at the institutional level in about a third of UK universities, and sort of the grassroots level at maybe a bit more than half of UK universities. And that's driving a lot of change within universities. So in my university, part of the appraisal that every faculty member has every year, within psychology, they would say how many pre-registrations they've done that year. Now, I'm betting, or I'm told, that a lot of people, maybe most people, have done none. So it's not as if, I mean, that's part of the failure, really. We've got the ideas out there and they're talked about, and it's part of it's a new value system that we have. But the number of people actually actively engaging with it is actually rather small, but still it's there. It's one of the questions that is asked, and people are encouraged at the institutional level to engage with open science. And that's probably somewhat UK specific because of the reach of UKRN and maybe the existence of REF, and maybe because we don't have an upper quartile system for papers. And in our research assessment exercise, the REF, they explicitly state where you publish does not matter. We don't look at the journals when we're assessing your publications. We read them and make a qualitative judgment. Whether that's exactly true or not, I don't know. But that's the explicit commitment that they're making. That enables things like peer community and so on to be valid. But if you have an upper quartile system of assessment, then that sort of stifles that sort of innovation. So I don't know if that explains some of the cultural differences between different countries, and hence some of the failures of open science to truly embed in some places rather than others.
Absolutely. Thanks for getting us started with some of those successes and setbacks. Aurélien, do you want to expand on any of those or share your own ideas?
I think Zoltan's proposal was very interesting in terms of referring to the progress made in terms of adding a new set of values. And I think it has also involved a change in the duties we have as scientists. So there has always been the discourse, or at least there has been at least for 100 years, the discourse on science being self-correcting. But the culture of the last, let's say, 15 years in psychology has been that we should actually do as much as we can to further this progress by learning new methods, by learning new tools, by building a better community. And so there has been this major change in the research cultures within psychology that we should try to progress and to improve science, like SIPS, of course, has been trying to do over the last 10 years. And so this culture of self-improvement, to me, has been a major aspect of the progress in open science. And then, of course, it has involved a lot of very different small changes. So it has involved changes in education. I don't have hard data on that, but I feel that nowadays young psychologists are much better trained in statistics, or at least much more aware of statistical difficulties than they used to be like 20 years ago. And of course, there has been all the changes that Zoltan has alluded to, like the changes in terms of pre-registration, open data, and just the fact that at least nowadays, most articles in major psychology journals have open data, or at least that a large share of them are pre-registered, is in itself a major change compared to what the situation was 10 years ago. And the question asks both about successes and setbacks. The setback possible, I don't think there has been any major setback, like the progress has been pretty smooth. But one possible setback could be that it's not clear how deep these changes have been. So there is a will for self-improvement. There is an idea that there are values, open science values, and we are registering or stuff like, or doing open data, stuff like that. But it's still a lot of box checking, and it's still a lot of very shallow changes in many respects. Like in terms of open data, it's often hard to access, and the data often are not very well written up and stuff like that. And in terms of registration, it's often very vague and hard to check and stuff. So we have made a lot of success in terms of changing research culture and changing practices, but knowing how deep these and influential these changes will be for the long run is certainly very hard to know.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Katie, would you like to add anything?
Oh, sure. Lots of good ideas brought up already. I like the distinction that Zoltan started with about the distinction between careerist values and open science values. I see that tension myself a lot, and I feel like one of the things that's been happening recently has been more concerted attempts to directly address the careerist values, sort of separate from or alongside the open science values. And I see this a lot in my work currently with ASAP Bio. This is, not a psychology specific problem. It's a academic research problem that, persists across disciplines. That the kinds of changes that we propose, whether it's, sharing data or preprinting or any of these kinds of things, none of them are likely to be very sticky if we don't address the careerist side of the equation. And that, it pervades sort of up and down the academic career ladder. And it's a very challenging problem to address because of the natural selection of bad science, the small dino argument from, forever ago. If the people who, are at least implicitly bought into the careerist motives are the ones that are likely to play the game and get ahead, then by the time, they do that, they're in a position to make the rules for others, and you don't see strong changes. But I'm very heartened by the real progress that has been observed. I would say more Europe-wide rather than just the Netherlands and the UK. The work that Quora has been doing is very impressive, and they've had a lot of success, I think, in getting cultural changes instigated at universities that are likely to be a little bit more persistent in terms of how people are evaluated. But if we don't change those factors, then it's unlikely that people will change their other habits. in the long term.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I want to use what Katie just said and a comment that Michael just put in the chat to move us to a related question of what challenges still remain. Some of you have talked about this, and how can they be addressed at these different levels, at the individual level, at the institutional level, and more systemically. And because Michael specifically was responding to Aurélien, I'll have you start if that's okay.
Yes, of course. So regarding Michael's comments, yeah, I completely agree that it's very hard to know how important the knowledge of methods is. Like we like in all fields, we like to use complex methods, but having a deep grasp of these is still very hard and will require changes in generations. But regarding the biggest challenges, I think one major challenge is knowing how much progress we have made exactly. I think it's very striking that we have the reproducibility project psychology, so we know the replicability rate of studies in psychology in top journals from 2008, and we have done a lot of reforms, but has this really improved the replicability of psychology or social psychology or cognitive psychology? We basically have no idea. And so there have been other major replicability projects, but there is still no systematic periodic replicability projects. Like we don't know how replicable psychology has become in 2015 or 2020, or we won't know for sure for 2025. And so basically keeping track of whether psychology is replicable, and so incentivizing better replicability is still an open question. So I've advocated in favor of regular large-scale replicability projects, so replicability audits targeted at journals. And I think this aspect of keeping track of replicability and giving incentives towards journals for improving replicability is still very much open. And so we have made progress towards making more replications, but it's still very little. And this can be said for any of the open science practices. For pre-registration, for instance, it's very hard. So in this respect, actually, we have kept track, at least of, there have been studies trying to see whether pre-registration has had a positive impact in terms of improving the reporting of novel results, for instance. And my reading of the literature is that so far the answer is that pre-registration doesn't help specifically to increase the reporting of novel results. So there have been two major studies comparing pre-registered studies and non-pre-registered studies. And in psychology, one of them conducted by led by Olmo van den Hacker found that there was basically no difference between pre-registered studies and non-pre-registered studies in terms of the reporting of novel results. And that is somewhat concerning. But when we look at pre-registrations, it's very clear that they're very often shallow, that there are a lot of deviations and stuff like that. So knowing how to improve this in the long run is going to be tough. And I feel that there should be more checks, like institutions that should be there to specifically conduct these replications and check the validity of the pre-registrations or stuff like that. And the OSF has been doing some of the work, but it's still very little and won't be done without major increase in funding towards replicability issues. So yeah, a lot of change. So still a lot of challenges, but I think one of the major challenges is still epistemic. We don't know how much replicability has changed, and we don't know exactly what can help to change to improve replicability. So this is a major challenge ahead.
Thank you for sharing. Michèle, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Aurélien just said. I also wrote down that I think we are at a point that we really need more empirical evidence, preferably experimental empirical evidence to see what interventions are actually working. And I think it has been justifiable to some extent that over the last 10 years, we've kind of jumped on the bandwagon and broadcasted about all these cool new initiatives. And these are all born out of very solid ideals, I think, about open science, about transparency, about being held accountable for choices you make. And I think it was necessary to promote these solutions, even if there wasn't that much empirical evidence. I can kind of get behind this first spur of just trying to get it into the field. And I think that has worked very well in the sense that things are becoming more mainstream. And now is a very good moment, I think, to take a step back, zoom out a bit, and be self-critical, and to really start collecting data for these different interventions. And I think even saying like we need more data to see if, for instance, pre-registration works or not is a too simplistic question. We are now, I think, at a point that we can also ask questions to see like when does pre-registration work and what form should it take, and does it work for everybody? Are there any negative side effects, for instance, for people from different backgrounds? If you're in an early career stage, can this harm your career somehow? How can we deal with that? So I think it's really a matter of money, as always, more money for more research in order to back up these kind of interventions or disqualify these kinds of interventions with data following the best methods that we have currently.
Yeah, thank you. Julia, can I invite you in?
Yeah. Building on what Michèle said, this is one of the points that I was eager to make too, is that, you know, when we are looking at how well these practices are working, I think there has been, especially early on, a tendency to kind of like simplistically classify work as like using open science practices or not, right? And this is kind of like the whole idea with badges on journals is like it's pre-registered or it's not. When some studies are pre-registered, but are pre-registered really badly. And so when we're doing like kind of meta-scientific work, and by badly, I mean in ways that don't limit researcher degrees of freedom or don't make it clear exactly what they're going to do. And so when we're doing meta-scientific work, saying how well does pre-registration work, it can easily look like it's not working well if you're combining together unclear, underspecified pre-registrations with better specified pre-registration. So I think also like coming up with some better ways of evaluating the quality of open science practices is really important. And then also the question of like, does it work for what, right? Like, does it change the number of null results that are published? Does it make it easier for people to replicate those studies, right? It's not just about like what happens with the p-values at the end, but like, does it make it, does it facilitate future replications? Mm-hmm. And then assuming that these practices that are grounded in ideals that many of us, value, assuming these things work. I remember at a SIPS many years ago, Brian Nosek talking about like, first you have to make a practice possible, then you have to make it easy and expected and rewarded, and then you have to make it required. And, we're at the point now where open science practices are certainly possible. They're becoming more rewarded like than they used to be, at least. And so I think one of the challenges going forward is thinking about how we make them, if and how we make them required in ways that are not burdensome for people doing specific kinds of research or people from specific backgrounds, how to make them required in equitable ways.
Yeah. Katie, please go ahead.
The comments so far have given me an opportunity to get on a hobby horse, which is I have one of the things that I would most like to see in terms of data or information that we could have that we really don't have easily, is that I think the systems that we're using to keep track of and link together various open science outputs are really, how do I want to say them? They're really basic. Like there's almost no actual real infrastructure that underlies this whole package of things that we've, asked people to do and more people are doing, right? So you can use Open Science Framework, for example, to share your data and code and so on. But then what we do is we ask people to take that information and then just like link it into their journal article. But there's so much other richer information that we usually collect with journal articles. Like one of the major services that journals provide to us or should provide to us is this kind of enriching of articles with metadata that's sort of keeping track of all of these things. And one of the more frustrating things that I've been part of over the last few years. I'm not involved anymore, but I was the chair of the Open Science and Methodology Committee for APA. And one of the things that we were trying to get them to do was to track the badges as metadata. So this would allow you to search, for example, in PsycInfo for badged articles, or to count the number of badges that are being given out, or any of this kind of stuff. And they were so resistant to doing any of that kind of counting. I'm laughing about it now because at a certain point it became kind of absurd. But I think it's not really just APA or any of these things. It's that we have, these are actually quite complicated problems, sort of how you keep track of, the data that's associated with these various outputs and link them together in a way that, makes sense in terms of a full information architecture. And I would really love to see that mature and for it to be much easier for us to have these, living articles, reprints, whatever you would like, with, real outputs attached to them.
Yeah, and another specific example beyond the one you just gave, Katie, was given by Bjorn in the chat on like keeping track of pre-registrations and then what happens to them after, right? So is there a way to track these things, maybe using that kind of like metadata system and incentivizing people to publish or at least preprint the outcome of that, and asking about like whether that might have a cooling effect on pre-registration and decreasing use if that was the expectation that it was going to turn into something. Zoltan, would you like to either tackle that or share your thoughts on what has been discussed so far?
Well, I think I don't think anyone will know how to pre-register until they've done a registered report. So they should go through that process where the pre-registration is reviewed by reviewers, and an editor who's experienced with it has gone through it to say, this is what a pre-registration effect looks like, because for a registered report, you need to get it right. And so when you've been through that collaborative process and that then had to live by it in producing the stage 2, that is a real education. I think it's transformative. And then once you've understood the registered report process, you can sort of replicate it as it were in your own OSF pre-registrations. But I really don't think people know how to, given the amount of editorial guidance and help I have to give people who are earnestly trying to do the registered reports in many cases. I think people just don't know how to do it. It's something you have to learn. So I mean, one thing I would advise as a if you take on PhD students is that in the first year you work on a registered report through peer community and registered reports, and so the PhD student gets going with a registered report as part of the training, and then in the other times they do other stuff, but then that then becomes part of postgraduate training if you do it that way. So I'm not surprised that most pre-registrations are rather useless. So yeah, it's not surprising that pre-registration, if you just tell people pre-register, go on, off you go, and then we find it doesn't do much, it's not terribly surprising. People need to learn how to do it properly. And then the other thing in terms of learning to do things properly, learning process, is you don't know about how to make your data open until you've had someone else try and use your data and say reproduce your results, because you don't know, you didn't know your data was so useless and until someone else tried to use it. And so you have to be dragged through that process in order to understand what open data is. And so something any deans listening now, every dean should have, they should have the reproducibility statistician in their departments that any researcher could give their paper to before submitting it for it to be reproducibility checked, as we have at Sussex, because that is, I mean, part of that when we do that with people is they're learning how to do it. They didn't know how to do it before. They really, you know, you really have to learn how to do it in order to get that right.
That kind of both you talking about like the specific incentives and the infrastructure at specific institutions that I look at from my institution. I'm like, there's never any world where we would, you know, have that. And so as a transition, maybe we could talk about like whether there are specific subfields or communities or methods that need more attention in this next phase of reform. And Julia, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, I've been like thinking about like what the open science movement was like kind of in early days and what it's like now. And I remember really clearly, so I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I remember early on talking with other folks in cognitive about open science practices. And a lot of folks in cognitive being like, well, yeah, but that's just like social psychology's problem. They're the ones with the issues, but like us here in cognitive, we're fine. And I was really struck that like every new area that you talk to, the neuroscientists are like, oh, that's just behavioral stuff, but like brain stuff is fine. And that everybody, you know, was kind of like able to be like, oh, well, those people have it worse. So like, we don't have to do much in the way of reform. And then as, you know, replication efforts come out in like more areas and people start to think more about researcher degrees of freedom. And like, I think it has kind of come to light in each of those areas that like, oh, no, we've got problems. They're just like maybe different problems. Like cognitive psychologists don't think much about reliability, and you know that's an issue that you will, it's rare to find like a Cronbach's alpha in any kind of cognitive paper, and so the issues that we have to deal with in different subdisciplines are really different. And so I think one of the things that I've been like kind of thinking about and like and looking at lately are what are the places where people are still saying, oh, that's their problem, but it's not our problem. And then also thinking about how some of the solutions just have to be kind of different in different subdisciplines, right? Like pre-registration works kind of differently if you're working with an existing data set than if you're collecting new data. And sharing data looks different if you have sensitive data than if you have, you know, non-sensitive data. And so I think, and I think there have been some like kind of missteps in open science along the way, where when people say, my subdiscipline faces a different kind of issue than your subdiscipline, people not listening enough to what those differences are. Because I think like most disciplines can probably benefit from pre-registration and being more transparent about the process. But what that looks like might be different for qualitative data than for quantitative data. And I think it's important when people say our stuff is different for like us to rather than being like, no, do it our way. Be like, well, in what ways is it different? And how could we achieve some of the same goals, even if the process doesn't look exactly the same? And this also links back to what I was mentioned before about making things required and being careful when we make things required that we're not setting requirements that don't work for lots of different disciplines. And then the other thing that I think is really important about like thinking in this next phase of reform is thinking more about generalizability. There is a great paper. I'm gonna drop a link in the chat that came out in January, but somehow it just made its way onto my desk recently. Led by Sakshi Ghai. It's called A Manifesto for a Globally Diverse, Equitable, and Inclusive Open Science. And it introduces the idea of questionable generalizability practices, and introduced the idea of masking, which is making assumptions based on skewed knowledge. So thinking more about external validity and how the participants that we're sampling affect the kind of conclusions that we can draw. And so it does a really nice job kind of pointing out how some of the issues that we think about open science, many of which are related to the internal validity, thinking about how we can take those out in a more global and equitable way. So I think like that's also needs to be part of the next phase.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for sharing that that paper and those ideas with us. Zoltan, do you want to build on any of that?
Well, there's also sort of a contrast case, which is some fields who do it right. The head of our university level open research group is an astrophysicist. And he said in their field, well, it's all open data. And you always have two teams independently doing the same analyses. And it's only if they replicate it that the result counts. And all the outputs are as preprints. Even if something's published in a journal, people will by default look at the preprints rather than the journals per se. So that sounded like a field that's way ahead of the rest of us, but that's sort of kind of reassuring. It means it can be done. There's no reason why we can't do it. It's already is being done in some other fields. I would think, I mean, you're mentioning cognitive, saying maybe this is just social psychologists. I think cognitive neuroscience needs a good looking at, just because of the analytic degrees of freedom are absolutely enormous. And if one Likert scale could, your dependent variable is one Likert rating or a couple, and then we can construct, a whole bunch of effects out of thin air with behavioral priming with that. And what on earth can you do with fMRI, EEG, and so on? But the resistance that there is stronger because each study is so expensive to run. So that makes it, there's less incentive to try and sort of dig into this. You need to get results from the grant, right? Because it was a bloody big grant and it cost a lot of money. But I think that really needs, and pre-registration is difficult, partly because of anonymity of your data and data size, but these can all be dealt with.
And yeah, your response kind of touches on what Katja put in the chat about, what about replicating these really large scale projects that are going to be really expensive and difficult to do for various reasons, and what does that look like? And it kind of connects back to what Julia was talking about of like, how can we envision an open science that works to achieve the goals for all of these different communities like at the same time, rather than trying to put one way of doing things on all of our very diverse research programs. Katie, I think you might have something to share too.
Yeah. So earlier this year, back in January, I helped to organize a small conference for sociologists and, sociologists, social psychologists. There's some overlap there, but also some, important differences. And, the people in the audience was a mixed audience of maybe half people who did mixed methods or maybe even mostly qualitative research, and the other half who were more quantitative researchers. And I tried out a new argument on them, which I think I'll try again. I'll pitch it here to this audience and we'll see if you all like it or not. They did not like it at all. So we can say it's probably a failure and not likely to take off, but maybe interesting. So the argument was, and this is also not just my idea, by the way, this is a paper that I've been working on with Eva Mayo Wilson and Sean Grant and David Mower, kind of spelling out not just some different functions of registration, but also sort of different ways that we should be talking about some of these practices. So this is a bit roundabout, but I think hopefully I'll get to it quickly. So the basic idea was, I think these differences, these arguments that we have among different fields about whether or not, a particular practice like registration is applicable to different fields are mostly misguided. And in fact, in the case of registration, I've come around to the idea that I think all studies should be registered. However, I actually mean registration in a fairly narrow sense of entering a study in a registry. So, what we do on the OSF and what you all are referring to as pre-registration is a pretty specific form of registration that involves like a whole bundle of things. It bundles together study protocols, analysis plans, all kinds of things that are all sort of bound up in what that pre-registration is. I think we should unbundle it. I think bundling it together was actually a mistake. And I think instead we should talk about separate practices of registrations, protocols, and analysis plans. And then when you do that, that opens up a whole sort of new space. So if a registration is simply an entry in a registry that documents that a study is planned to happen, then it doesn't matter what form that study takes. Anyone can, enter a study in a registry and have it, mean something. So why would anyone want to do this? Well, my argument was that there's part of the original rationale for biomedical registries was that you wanted to be able to find all of those studies that had been done. So you'd be able to locate, all of the various studies, whether or not they ultimately ended up published. Because what we have right now is a system where all research is registered badly by journals, right? So it's actually not, right? Not all studies end up published, but like that is the most complete registry we have of studies that have been done. So if you strip away all of that stuff of the current system and instead imagine a system where the first thing you do when you're going to do a study is you register its existence, and then later you can add on things to it like a detailed protocol or an analysis plan and so on. And then things like, does an analysis plan make sense or not for qualitative versus quantitative studies? Those become entirely different debates, because then the question is about sort of the content of, what constitutes a good analysis plan for a quantitative versus a qualitative study, but not whether or not the practice of registration is important. I think registration could have value for all of us regardless. Now, debate amongst yourselves, maybe this is not the appropriate venue for that, but I don't know. I'm getting kind of bored of panels, so maybe this is like my time to throw a bomb into this panel and just like mix it up.
Let's do it. Yeah, Zoltan.
Just have a reaction to that. I don't know what it means to register a study if you didn't know what the study was going to be. So you need some way of knowing what the study was about, don't you, for it to be registered?
Yeah.
And so then that means
minimal would have to have minimal features like what variables are going to be involved and so on. And so then maybe quickly that, but I think they do this. If you look at clinicaltrials.gov, it is basically a pretty minimal registry, right? Like they don't have analysis plans. They don't have these other features. And you could say that's a downside of clinicaltrials.gov, but it does, that style of registry does allow you to say, find all the studies on acetaminophen or whatever.
I think I'm most excited by the part of this idea that I can imagine that things become so much easier to make machine readable and findable. I think that alone makes me enthusiastic about this idea.
Does anyone else, either from the panel or from the audience, want to speak to this? Ask other questions? Sociologists did not like it, Katie said.
What was the reason against it?
Everyone thinks that registration is going to be a waste of time, regardless of like how complex or simple you make it. And I think to an audience that is not necessarily convinced of having a complete record of all studies, then the value is not necessarily as apparent. So like what this would do is it truly would allow you to open the file drawer if everyone adhered and it was perfect and so on. Then you would know how many of these studies actually made it to some further state of completion.
This is not the main takeaway, but it was also salient to me that jingle jangle fallacies have now permeated meta-science research, which is also a fun new problem that we have to deal with. All right. I don't see any hands or anything. So we've been kind of talking about like the past or the origination of open science and the future. And Michèle has kindly offered to talk a little bit about how we might be able to strike a balance between the institutionalization of open science practices to some of these, norms or defaults that we've been talking about, while also preserving the movement's original spirit and values and community-driven momentum. So if you want to share any of your thoughts on that, that would be awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was a very interesting question and very much where we are at now. Like we were all grassroots before, and now we are entering the realm of institutionalization and talking about stakeholders and all the, complex, slow, bureaucratic, well, what have you. I think both are very important for very different reasons. So the whole spirit of like new ideas, of collaboration, of excitement that kind of kicked off also the first SIPS meeting and all the initiatives that have kind of sprung from there, I think is very important to also maintain. I think it inspires new ideas that we maybe hadn't thought of. It allows us to react flexibly to like new technology. Like everyone is talking about all the LLMs and what we can do with it, but at the same time, they pose a problem with paper mills that make it so this technology makes it a lot easier also to produce shoddy research. So what is our response? And I think having this flexible mindset and collaboration and involving a lot of early career researchers will definitely help us come up with solutions. But then the next step is, of course, to actually do something with these things. And there you need the institutionalization. You need incentives, you need bigger stakeholders. And I think the challenge is to get it from the realm of like this the grassroots spirit to the institution, to the institutions. And I think stakeholders such as journals and funders have a major role to play here. And I really remember, I think it was when Simine Vazir was editor of Calabra, that she said, like, I want to err on the side of action and just try out things and then see if it works out, instead of like, if we're not sure if an incentive is really going to do something, let's just try it and see. And I think such risk-taking is necessary on the side of the stakeholders because we don't have the large-scale data now to back up some of these solutions. So we need to, at some point, try it in order to get the infrastructure there, to get the empirical data in order to test it. But I do think that last thing is also an important element here. Just like throwing solutions out there is only the beginning, and then we need a sense of adventure from the stakeholders involved, but also meticulous recording of what has been done. Can we see some effects? Do we see negative side effects? And if it proves successful, we can lobby it to the maybe more established and maybe more a bit risk-averse stakeholders. But also if it proves unsuccessful, just abandoning it and saying, well, it was a good shot. Alas, it didn't work out. So I feel like there could definitely be some kind of ecosystem where both of these elements work together very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that framing. Does anyone want to build on what Michèle was talking about? No. All right.
Let's implement
I'll just, let me,
Julia, okay, yes, Julia.
You said it so well. I was like, I don't want to.
I know, right?
No, but I think the thing, I mean, I really like this idea about being bold and trying things, because, when we want to ask questions like, how well is pre-registration working at lots of different things, that's easier to do if we have required all papers in a particular journal to do it, or something like that. And then also going back to a point that Katie made earlier about the importance of metadata. And it's funny because, early on in the open science reform movement, like, there were so many things that I was really excited about for like these ideological reasons. And now that I find myself like excited about metadata, I'm just like, oh man, we're like getting in the weeds about things here. But actually metadata is like so important. And so I'm now on the committee that Katie was talking about earlier, the APA Open Science Methodology Expert Task Force. And one of the things that we have discovered as part of that is that there are a bunch of questions that we want to ask that we just can't ask because there isn't even like a flag where you can easily say, give me all of the registered reports at all APA journals. And so this idea of like being bold and trying to implement things, and it may be that even if we come up with a way of like adding metadata so that it's easy to grab studies that are pre-registered or registered or studies that are registered reports, maybe the first way we try it is bad, but then like we learn why it's bad and can hopefully like do it better at the next go around. And so, yeah, I, you know, in the spirit of like perfect is the enemy of done, I really like that spirit of boldness.
Absolutely. Right. I don't see anyone else jumping to share, so I will move on to our next question, kind of thinking about this boldness and risk-taking and what we can learn. Also thinking about how, and this has been talked about a little bit, like what other fields can learn from how psychology has approached reform thus far, and also how we as psychologists can learn from other disciplines and fields. Aurélien, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure I can say a lot about how other fields should imitate psychology, because I feel that a lot of the success for psychology has been being struck by a series of very serious scandals about replicability, about fraud, like the BEM paper or the issues with the Stapel or stuff like that. And so there has been a very strong historical moment where there was this feeling of crisis in psychology that has led to the sense of adventure that Michèle was talking about, like the fact that it has become very grassroots and very organized and very energetic in a way, that there has been so many initiatives over the next few years. And so this feeling of very strong crisis followed by a very strong grassroots reform movement is, I think, very hard to reproduce, because it has been a very strong, very interesting and surprising coincidence that all of these scandals would have happened at the same time in psychology. So I don't exactly know what other fields can take from psychology. I think one major aspect of the success of the reform movement has been the community aspect and the large-scale collaborative aspects, so which can be seen from the, let's say, so the reproducibility project psychology, the many labs, the many analysts, all the many aspects, and now with the Psych Science Accelerator, that has been some kind of institutionalized in a way. So this large-scale collaborative aspect has been a major part of the success of reforms in psychology, and so I think it's a very strong force that we can bring to other fields. What can we learn from other fields? I feel that it's going to be like piecemeal, a bit from a lot of different fields. I think I like the fact that clinical trials, at least in medicine, have a very strong mandatory aspect. That at least due to obvious regulatory reasons, you have to publish your data, and that there are agencies that are going to force you to publish your data if you don't want to, even if you don't want to. Of course, it's not very well applicated, and actually a lot of companies or universities don't share their data, but at least there is a very norm for sharing data that it's much stronger than in psychology. And so I think going forward to not just registering, but also making a very strong norm of putting open data, even if you don't publish your papers, should be one major aspect of it in the next few years. So that's medicine. I feel a major aspect of, it's not exactly open science culture, but it's slow science culture in a way, is from economics, where they have very strong norms about writing good papers, like not just writing a lot of very small weekish papers that you can publish, but really doing one major job market paper during your PhD. And that is going to take you years of painstaking data collection if you want to make it really good. And in psychology, we have an equilibrium where everyone is expected to publish several papers a year. And even when these papers are not very strong or very good, that it's better to publish several papers than just one major excellent paper. And so economics is one of the only discipline in industrial sciences that doesn't have that culture. And I think it's really, so doing the slow, careful way as in economics would be a major progress for psychology. Of course, economics has a lot of other issues, but this focus on quality rather than quantity is one major thing we could take from them. And so, yeah, and I'm just going to mention a third thing. Neuroscience has also issues with replicability, but one very major interesting initiative over the last few years has been BIDS, led by Russ Poldrack. So the brain imaging data structure, which is a framework for sharing data that is enhancing the fact that the data should be easier to understand both by machine and by humans. So very strong standards for you have collected that kind of data and then you should report it that way. And so this facilitates community sharing and reusability of data. And I think right now in psychology, everyone is sharing data and we are drowning in an ocean of data, but that very few people are accessing. And so sharing data in a more structured way that can be very easily accessed and reused would be a major step forward.
Thank you for sharing those insights. Does anyone want to build on anything of that other
Well,
area?
one thing about economics as well is a number of their journals do reproducibility checking. So they're a little bit ahead of us on that. Just to follow up another point of Aurélien's, we could induce crises in other fields by doing statistical reproducibility checking on their papers, because I'm sure in many fields the statistics wouldn't reproduce from the data. That would be a start.
Okay,
I think it was nice to.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
go
ahead, Michèle.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say it was nice that you listed quite a lot of examples from different fields that touch upon very different issues. Because when I was thinking about this question, like what can we learn and what can people learn from us? And then the main thing I thought is we need to stay in contact with different disciplines because we have so many different problems, but also different systems in place that for us are completely obvious, but then for another field, absolutely mind-blowing. And I think we should definitely try our best to steal the best ideas from each other. So I'm very excited about these interdisciplinary meta research conferences where you sometimes hear debates where on the one hand you think like, why is this such a complicated debate? We solved this years ago. We should definitely talk, but also completely the other way around. Like walking around with an issue that has been vexing us for years and then seeing how another field solved it. And I think the examples that you give are just, we have like a buffet of fantastic practices and we need to definitely see what we can take for ourselves.
I fully agree. I find it amazing how some fields can be very high in sophistication in some respects and so very naive in other respects. And so the rise of meta science and cross-interdisciplinary sharing of good practices has been amazing. Regarding what Zoltan was saying about the fact that we can create crises in other fields by doing reproducibility checks, I think it might be harder than it appears, because the reproducibility project Cancer Biology was basically one attempt to do that. Like there were some biologists involved, but it was mostly like in large part the USF trying to push forward a reproducibility crisis in cancer biologists. But so far, the reproducibility project Cancer Biology has had terrible results. So arguably even worse than in psychology, with a decrease in effect size by about 90%. So between the original and the replication. So it's an absolute catastrophe, and it's in many respects worse than the reproducibility of project psychology, but it has led to much less discussion and much less reform than reproducibility project psychology. So I felt one thing that has been amazing for psychology has been that everyone, or at least not everyone, but a lot of people were on board, and it has led to a sense of crisis among the community. And it's very hard to stimulate it from the outside, I feel.
I wanted to note what Mahmoud put in the chat about learning from speech language therapy and how psychology can benefit, or how it can benefit from psychology for helping, you know, improve training and educational programs and all of this, while psychology can learn from trust and piloting from speech language therapy reporting, even from these like smaller scale pilot studies. So I, like Michèle, was struck by the diversity of different fields where each we can kind of take, and I like that framing of stealing or kind of leveraging all of these good ideas that everyone has, and how different people in different disciplines approach problems so differently and approach solving those problems, and that we can all benefit from each other when we have this kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, as opposed to just staying kind of stuck in our narrow ways, which again connects back to what Julia mentioned at the beginning of this of, you know, thinking not just imposing our quantitative solutions on qualitative research and mixed methods research, and all of these kinds of things kind of come together. Does anyone else want to ask a question or add on?
Just to put in another example about like borrowing from other disciplines. I have done some work looking at like error prevention in research. And as doing part of that, doing the research to like better understand that, you know, got really into like how medical fields avoid amputating the wrong leg, and how nuclear power plants avoid having meltdowns. And was so struck at how there are some standard practices in psychology that people in other disciplines are just shocked by. You know, when I talked with computer programmers and software engineers about like, yeah, no, we just like a grad student writes code and then nobody ever looks at it and then it never gets published. They're just, you know, they're just completely appalled. And so I think that looking at the way that other disciplines not just deal with how they share data, but like how they run their labs and how they implement systems where people are comfortable talking about their mistakes and you know, addressing how to fix them. And some of that is not about explicit practices that we're like systematically engaging in, but it's like about culture. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from other disciplines in that regard too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate you naming that teaching and mentoring component to all of this too, that, you know, we all learned how to do research from other people, and many of us are now engaging in that teaching either implicitly or explicitly with others. And so thinking about what we are incentivizing and in that case is really important. All right. I want to leave one more moment for questions about anything. I'm trying to, usually when I'm in person, I have a decent feel of the room. I'm having a harder time doing that via Zoom. Katya has a question about the role of funding and whether well-funded disciplines conduct better science or whether they engage in more questionable research practices. That is, yeah, I'd love to hear people's thoughts about this.
I guess to a large extent depends on where the funding came from.
I would just say no. My answer to the question is no.
Yeah. So this connects back to something Michèle started with of money. Money is a problem, right? Like not having enough of it is a problem for a lot of this stuff, but maybe it's not the solution either to all of this. So, yeah.
Yeah, there was that study, I'm blanking the names. Did Michèle mention it earlier? But about the looking at the sort of the natural selection of of good science, and p-hackers tend to be selected with a certain system of incentives. And when you look at the grant system, grants basically make that worse, because p-hackers get the grants, and the grants train the PIs train the PhD students and release little p-hackers into the community. So on that model, well-funded research should have worse p-hacking. Maybe that explains why in the reproducibility project, I don't know exactly what area of biology was it, sort of pre-cancer, preclinical cancer biology. That I imagine that's very well funded, and that when you do the reproducibility check on that, you get effect sizes which are 10% rather than half of the original effect size. That might be some indication. Sorry, I'm blanking the author's name, but the outcome was that if grants were held partly by a lottery, you then break the tie, which is an idea that some people are playing with anyway. Some funders introducing a lottery element. I don't know if you can always have a lottery for everything, but
my longer answer besides no was just that I've spent the last year now cosplaying as a biologist, and I've learned that nearly everyone there is well-funded. Like, it's almost by definition you have to be well-funded, otherwise you basically cease to exist. So it's unlike psychology in that there are very few life scientists who are able to do research without funding, whereas maybe this is my weird corner of psychology, but I feel like in the social sciences it's a bit more mixed. Like, people go periods of time where they don't have a grant, or they, so that's a very different thing culturally, and it produces, I think, a different incentive structure. Another things I've noticed about the life sciences is that it's humongous, like orders of magnitude bigger than us. So like your typical, large American research university will have, multiple, not just sub areas, like we have sub areas of psychology. There's, whole departments dedicated to cardiology or whatever it is, and whether or not there's medical school. So that's a difference. But so I think, yeah, the presence of funding there has very little to do with the quality of research. And instead, if there's any selection, it's on whether or not someone is able to persist into the grant getting position. So like there's a big selection pressure at the whoever is matriculating from postdoc to PI roles. There's a big pressure there. But in terms of comparing grants that are better funded to less funded and so on, that's a very different circumstance so far.
But I feel it shouldn't be just how well funded it is, but how much it costs to create one unit of data. Like for biologists, if you're training rats and doing brain imaging of rats or stuff like that, it's going to be so costly to raise the rats and then train them or inject some substance and then just slice the brains and analyze the data, stuff like that. So in that case, even if they are well funded, the sample sizes end up being incredibly small at the end. And so in this case, in a way, they are less well funded than social psychologists who can recruit thousands of participants with just a few $100 on, prolific or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
On the other side of things, though, you have the cell people who can, propagate cells endlessly, but then they're still limited by person hours in terms of however long it takes a technician or a student or whatever to process the data or acquire it or whatnot. So, but they still require, even those, the cell people also require millions of dollars each year to run their operation. Each of them, hundreds of them. Like, the scale of it is hard. It boggles my mind every time I think about it. It's massive.
I think for the reproducibility projects, cancer biology, I think the one cost that I saw was $50,000 per replication or something like that. And I don't have the figures for psychology, but it wouldn't be that much by, another one of two order of magnitudes. I don't know. So yeah, it's yeah, you have to compare so many different different parameters to know exactly how well funded some fields are.
It sounds so frustrating, because how like the more expensive research is, the more important it becomes. You could argue that it's of very high quality and very robust. So if you can only have 15 rats in your study because it's so expensive what you plan to do, then do whatever you can to register it very well, to make sure that there is an unbiased record of whatever you found out there, findable. So then in the long run, we can still have a healthy cumulative science, even though like studies still may be small, but then research money wouldn't be wasted. So it's so frustrating that then there's so much money in this cancer biology field and related fields, and then you see the results of this project fail so badly. And also in a way, like it's not even that the effect sizes were so much smaller when you replicated it. I think the most mind-boggling finding to me from the project was that in 0 of the cases, it was possible to actually understand what the protocol was without contacting the author. So the whole process was so intransparent that I feel like there's so much to be gained, and we should really work hard. And I really hope that, in the end, we do need money, so we do need the funders, and we do need their support in order to achieve this. So the key lies into how funders assess proposals and what is considered a good research proposal. And it should not be like flashy results in previous research, but very solid ways of guaranteeing that whatever you do is going to be out there and is going to be the most robust as it can.
Great. I feel like we have talked a lot about these frustrations and these problems that we're facing, which is really important, because in order to solve the problems, we need to name them. But in an effort to end this conversation with some hope, I am turning to Julia, a source of a lot of hope and optimism, for a moment that has made you feel generally hopeful or excited about the future of science, and particularly from this open science framework.
Yeah, when I saw this question on the list, I was just like, oh yeah, I'm signing up for that one, because like I feel hopeful about the future of science all the time. It is a moment in America where it is particularly hard to be optimistic about the future of science. But in terms of like the changes that have been made in the last decade, it's hard for me to pick just one, but I think the thing that makes me feel overwhelmingly hopeful is looking at the early career researchers and the enthusiasm with which they have approached open science practices, and like looking at the age of SIPS attendees and seeing how early career researcher skewed it is, and just realizing that a lot of the divisions between people who are excited about open science practices and excited about reform, that there's like, it is clear that the next generation is bringing a lot of enthusiasm about making the research that we do reproducible and equitable. And so I think like, you just like have to be optimistic about the future when you see how awesome the like next generation is. And I don't mean just with like the fact that grad students are more likely to understand how pre-registration works than full professors. But also like the tools that they are coming up with, and the groups and organizations that they're forming, and the podcasts that they're making. And it is clear that like there are really wonderful, bright, eager minds who are keen to push to try to continue to improve the discipline, and that's who's coming up. That's a big one. I also the advent of peer community in registered report evaluation has been another moment in the last couple of years where I've just been like, man, we like keep coming up. We as a discipline keep coming up with ways of improving what we're working on. And it is really like inspiring to be part of these groups where people just keep having awesome ideas about how to do things better. And I am, you know, the like replication crisis may have started in psychology, though it is clearly not a psychology problem. It is like a science problem more generally. But I'm really proud that so many of the reforms have come from us as well. And I think that may be in part because we know that human bias can play out even if you don't want it to, and we know that it's possible for us to put our thumbs on the scale even without intending to, and things like that. And so I just continue to be excited about and impressed by all the reforms.
Amazing. Well, in the spirit of quality over quantity of time, I think we should wrap up there. I think that was a really positive note to end on. Thank you so much to our incredible slate of panelists for sharing their expertise. I felt like I learned a lot in the last hour and 15 minutes. I hope that you did too. I will stick around if anyone has questions about anything, but please join me in thanking our panelists before we go. And thank you all for attending online SIPS. I think we're close to the end of the programming. So hopefully some of you will be in Budapest, and that we will connect at some point in the future.